Most technologies being non-monetary have a very smooth adoption pattern because they're not really leverageable. Like if someone makes the radio and you go out and buy the radio, you have a radio now, and most people never want to go back to not having a radio. Same thing for electrification, same thing for the television, same thing for the internet, same thing for smartphones. As a new technology is introduced, it has this very smooth exponential growth pattern. Whereas if the good that's being adopted, the new technology that's being adopted is money, that's inherently going to be a bumpier and arguably slower process because it's inherently leverageable. So as soon as someone starts seeing that exponential curve upward, a lot of people's immediate reaction is to leverage it, but then by leveraging it, they cause bubbles. And then when you get one of those like, hype bubbles, human nature buys into that. And then when people lose a lot of money, they're if they didn't deeply understand what they were buying in the first place, which is true for most technology. You don't deeply understand the radio the first time you buy it. You don't deeply understand a television. You don't deeply understand the internet. You just know what it's solving for you. And so people buy into it, into a bubble. That bubble collapses due to leverage and speculation. It takes years to work back. And so a monetary technology, people actually do revert back to not adopting it, or at least a percentage of them. So if you get, a million new people in, maybe 300,000 of them leave during the bear market because they say, no, I made a mistake. This is a scam. And then it has to build back up slowly and have another wave of adoption and then another credit bubble, and then people de-adopt it. And so one thing that's kind of fascinating about watching Bitcoin monetize, and part of, I think, a case for, kind of the Talebs of the world, or the critics that argue that it's being ineffective or slow, is that this type of technology almost cannot adopt quickly, especially when you're up against such a powerful network effect. And so kind of the way that I end the book is to say there's really two forks in the road here. Either Bitcoin wins and the open source money kind of connects the world and solves these 160 different like currency firewalls around borders, or otherwise it's just more and more centralization. Basically, central bank digital currencies get even tighter locks on their own people, on their own borders, and that's I think not a future that most people should wish for. And one reason I try to appeal to a lot of different types of people in the book. That's why I try to steelman different views of money and try to talk as broadly as possible, is basically to say, look, there's really two paths here, and one path is bad for almost everyone. And so you should really support and increase the odds of this technology being robust and accepted. And instead of slowing it down, which means it takes longer to positively affect people's lives, people can do their role to accelerate it. And that the larger it gets, the more it can fix things, or at least the faster it can fix things for people in our lifetime rather than just the next lifetime. I think that's the powerful thing about it, is that it's highly portable money, and it's the first serious technology that pierces financial borders between people, because instead of just going through banks and airports, it's point to point potentially between everyone. So unless a country wants to be like North Korea and just completely isolate itself, it's gonna have a very, very hard time preventing Bitcoin, stablecoins, basically like the market for money, and more broadly the market for investable goods, is a lot more marketable now. That basically that it's brought to these are reducing inefficiencies in the market and having everybody in the world be able to compete for the best assets rather than just compete in their own ledger, in their own little ecosystem. And the current arrangement is that really only rich people in a lot of these countries can get offshore assets. They have access to global markets. They can get an offshore bank account, an offshore brokerage account, and it takes time for that to kind of go down to the middle class, the working class. And what this does is it reduces the overhead and it brings that to people around the world, whether their governments like it or not.
Yeah. Your final section of the book discusses Bitcoin and human rights. And that's something that I haven't really discussed much in detail in my work. I tend to try and appeal to people's greed because I think that's a lot more effective than trying to appeal to people's virtues. Because let's face it, greed is a lot better sell. But what is your thesis on why Bitcoin helps human rights?
Going back to that part I discussed, it basically when you're trapped in a currency bubble, your options are far more limited, and the people running that bubble have a lot more control over you. And so my argument is that the more tools you can give to people to have more autonomy in their own lives, either access to globally better assets, or best yet, access to just literally fully decentralized money that you can literally self-custody, gives you a lot more options. And then your ability, if you're debanked, if you're constantly dealing with inflation, the fact that you can hold this asset and then make permissionless payments to other people, that is just a very powerful human rights technology. And I do think in the long arc of time, greed's the most important variable. And it's part of, so open source has always had the challenge, which is that if it's not super profitable to work on, what's going to make people want to adopt it? And what's going to make people want to work on it? And the cool thing about Bitcoin is that it's open source, but it also gives you an incentive along with it. I think that's why it's going to be more successful than almost any other open source project in history. But I also think that appealing to people's emotions and appealing to people's kind of ethical frameworks is relevant, especially for certain types of people. And so you have pockets, either individuals or institutions, where especially if there's a lot of propaganda against it, there has to be kind of point by point answers to those kind of propaganda against it, or you need to develop such like a kind of just even if you're just not responding to their point, if you're building a case for why it is a good thing, and someone reads that and it's compelling to them, then when they go out and hear the arguments against it, they've been now they have answers. They have like a shield against kind of like the lower grade criticisms that you'll hear of Bitcoin. So what I try to do in that section is say it's not just about rich people getting richer, which is like a criticism you see. It's this is a tool of empowerment for people all around the world, and I find that that's a message that appeals. I mean, we ask in the Bitcoin community why is it so male dominated or why is it more right leaning? And I think there's natural reasons for that, but it's like you can still get waves of adoption from other groups by appealing to other facets of what Bitcoin fixes. And so I try to kind of bring that in a way that speaks to as many types of people as possible. Like, and there's certain groups I'm just going to write off. Like, I'm not going to try to convince a communist why they should adopt Bitcoin. They're just not. It's not. We don't speak the same language, so it's just not going to be a thing. But if someone's remotely in a language that I can speak to, then I try to speak to them.
Yeah, I agree entirely. Well, I'm perhaps not being very truthful there. I'm not nowhere near as diplomatic as you, so I could agree in theory, but I can't pull it off in practice. All right, I want to ask you on your chapter on the petrodollar. I gotta admit, I'm a little bit skeptical on the idea that the dollar is backed by that the dollar system is a petrodollar system. Give us your best pitch. I go back and forth, but tell us why you think it is a petrodollar system.
So one thing I do in the book is I often call it the euro dollar slash petrodollar system because it is both. It's not just that is a point. So you'll see often I find that the two camps of this, like the two extremes, to be neither fully correct. So some people say it's only because of deals in OPEC, for example. That's why the dollar has its power. I disagree with that. Other people say no, those deals had no impact at all. I think basically what we're witnessing is a powerful network effect occasionally do actions to keep the network effect going. Basically, when it in the 1970s, when the Bretton Woods system ended, it's like the dollar had its shields down. Like it had this ongoing massive network effect. It was still the largest economy, the largest military, but there was suddenly a problem in the sense that for the first time in the world, all these different countries had no reliable ledger that they couldn't just be printed by someone else. So up to that era, basically gold was some sort of foundation for the system, or bimetallic standards, or whatever the case may be. Under Bretton Woods, it was the gold-backed dollar, and now there was kind of like monetary chaos for a period of time, where the dollars that we had this era of like double-digit inflation. The U.S. was getting embargoed for oil, for geopolitical reasons due to its own decisions and basically the whole geopolitical mix that was happening. And so it was kind of like this moment where the shields were down and they still have this massive network effect. And so they say, well, let's use our military force, let's use the powers we have to keep this going for another cycle. And so it's unclear exactly what would have happened without those, but it's not a like it is documented that the Nixon administration, for example, went to Saudi Arabia and went to other countries and said, look, here's the deal we're going to make. And the only reason they could make that deal is because they already had the liquidity, they already had the network effects. Like Switzerland couldn't go out and make this deal, or Canada couldn't go out and make this deal. The remnants of the currency that had the remnants of the Bretton Woods system is the one that could make these deals, and they chose to do so to strengthen it. So basically, it's the idea that in addition to the dollar having already achieved the best salability among monies, they further strengthened it. And they said, look, if you want to be able to buy oil from these countries, you have to do it in dollars, and we're going to entice these entities that are very rich now to want to hold their cash balances in dollar equivalents, in bonds. So it's like basically it could have been an era where the dollar fell, or it could have been an era that a multipolar world opened up a little bit more quickly. And instead, I think they just solidified their network effect by shoring up some of their weaknesses and kind of ensuring that both in terms of demand for it and in terms of cash balances were maintained by using other resources that they had, which is like basically their military assets.
Yeah, I think I have to say, like, I was sympathetic to this viewpoint, but while writing the fiat standard, I've come to think that the thing that matters the most is the fact that the treasury market is the largest, most liquid market in the world. And I think everything else is largely window dressing next to that supremely important fact. So you could point to deals with Saudi Arabia. I think this is probably the most compelling point, is the one that you mentioned in your book. I think it's chapter 11, I think it is, yeah. But you mentioned the deal that they did with Saudi Arabia with King Faisal in the 1970s. And the terms of the deal was that the US would provide protection weapons and the Saudis would buy US treasuries and price the oil in dollar. Now, I don't think pricing the oil in dollar is anything other than psychological. In reality, you can price it in whatever you want and you can take payment in whatever you want. There's no strict way of enforcing what Saudi Arabia will take as payment from another country.